longer just be thinking about a lean, efficient supply chain. It needs to be flexible and resilient. And we have to pay a premium for reliability. And we have to think about how politics is going to affect reliability rather than just simply getting that bottom line number down as quickly as possible.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is the Digital Supply Chain Podcast, the #1 podcast focusing on the digitization of supply chain. And I'm your host, Global Vice President at SAP, Tom Raftery. Hi everyone, welcome to the Digital Supply Chain Podcast. My name is Tom Raftery with SAP, and my special guest on the show today is Jacob. Jacob, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. It's good to be with you, Tom. I wish I was with you in Spain and not here in New Orleans, Louisiana, but I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm the founder and chief strategist of Perch Perspectives. We're a human-centric political and business consulting firm that launched at the beginning of a global pandemic. We didn't design it that way, but we launched in April, and here we are trying to help companies navigate geopolitical risk and really trying to inject not just a robust, quantitative, data-oriented approach to managing risk, but also integrating human stories, human behavior in as equally rigorous a way in order to drive both opportunities and to mitigate risk for our clients.
Okay, so you mentioned we're in the middle of a pandemic. It's kind of an extraordinary time, as we've heard so many times. I think the use of the word unprecedented itself has been unprecedented in the last few months. You guys are doing risk management. It's obvious in the middle of a pandemic, we have a lot of disruption going on. But apart from that, why do people in supply chain need to manage risk, or what aspects of risk do they need to manage?
Yeah, so the COVID-19, as you said, it really drives home a lot of the importance of managing risk because, the first alert I sent to clients about something being, and I don't want to say that I called COVID-19, nobody called COVID-19, but we are monitoring China on a daily basis because China is one of the major actors in the global system. And if you were following China on a daily basis, you knew at the end of December something was up because Chinese social media was going crazy. And we had alerts out to clients saying, we don't know the scope of this, we don't know the scale of this, but you should start thinking about it. And that's the sort of reason you have risk management in place. It's really two reasons there. Number one, you know where to be looking for the problem. So you've actually sat down and thought about where the potential blockages or disruptions to the supply chain could be. And then you're monitoring for those early warning signs to make sure that you are prepared if something does happen. I often tell clients, a lot of what we do is, and you come from a futures background, we do a lot of forecasting and scenario planning. And obviously I would love to be right 1,000% of the time. I'm not. But the real value of doing forecasting and scenario planning from my perspective is that you've actually thought through the issue. So even if you get the exact outcome right, you've thought about all the issues that are there. You understand how a disease in China that goes unchecked could affect your supply chain, and you are able to pivot and be more resilient. And you can be one of those companies that actually transforms the pandemic into an opportunity rather than those that are caught flat-footed and discovered in March that they were up the creek without a paddle, as we say here in Louisiana.
So if I was a customer of Perch Perspectives, and if I had received those emails back in January saying you should look out, what's next step for me then?
The next, and this is another thing that Perch is doing differently than a lot of companies in the space. We don't just, we send out sort of generic alerts when we see something super important to clients, but we treat every engagement, every client as if they're completely unique. Everything is from scratch. So we don't assume, even if we've developed a full assessment a month ago on a topic a client is interested in, everything's from the ground up. So we rely on our clients to trust us enough and reach out to say, hey, I think this might affect me. And then we sit down and we forget everything we knew before, complete blue sky. Let's start from scratch. What are we missing? What are we thinking? And we try and build a quick assessment to understand what's changed, what hasn't changed. And then we help them make decisions, and we ask them to tweak parts of the model and tell us what parts aren't clear, what parts are clear, and then we go forward. I often say that the most productive and we have clients that run the gamut, but if you're calling us at the peak of a crisis, you didn't use the risk management tool correctly. What you want to do is you want to have systems in place so you're monitoring your supply chain. SAP does a great job of doing this, so you are aware of what's going on in real time. And you want to make sure, like I said, that you have a warning system in place, that you have an idea of what wrong looks like and what you might need to do to shift. And then you can course correct. Then it's not such a crisis thing. You don't have to have a knee-jerk reaction to something that's crazy. You can say, I already knew that US-China tensions were going to get really bad. I already had a plan for what to do if there was going to be some kind of worst-case scenario in US-China relations. I didn't know it was going to be a global pandemic that was going to catalyze it and set it off. But okay, like we're seeing enough smoke here that maybe we want to accelerate some plans forward. So the clients that we do best working with are those ones that understand that you invest on the front end so that when something like that faces you, it's not such a big deal. They can see the alert, they can immediately understand what's going on, and then we can craft the solution. We also do some crisis management, but once you get into the thick of a crisis, that's literally the definition of a crisis. You have less time to deal with what's going on, and you also have fewer and fewer options, which is relevant to businesses. It's also relevant to how countries in the world are behaving right now. One of the reasons the global system is so messed up, is the technical term, is that COVID-19 has reduced options for a lot of these countries. So whereas even 6 months ago, I was pessimistic, for instance, on US-China relations, I thought there was a possibility things could get better. There was a reasonable scenario in which Biden, for instance, wins an election and things get better. That's all gone now. And it's all because COVID-19 took the options off the table and we're only in one particular path. So that rambled a little bit, but that's what we like to do. We like to set up systems. We like to have mental maps in place. We like to have a monitoring system going forward. And that allows us to, as comfortably as possible, pivot, be resilient, be flexible when those early warning signals pop off on our radar.
Okay. And you mentioned risk management tool. Is that something you provide, or is that something you expect your clients to already have in place?
It's something that has to be collaborative. We're not one of these folks that's going to parachute in and fix everything for you. And if you're completely outsourcing your risk management to someone, that's going to be a mistake. Ultimately, clients know their business better than anyone else. When you reach out to someone like us, what you're saying is, I want a gut check. I want someone to check my work. I want somebody to look at it from a different angle, and I'm open to challenges and open to doing that. So all of our work is collaborative. We don't even pretend like we're going to come in with the crystal ball and present you with exactly what you need to do to mitigate all risk. You can't mitigate all risk. The best work is when the client sort of brings their expertise and trusts us to bring our expertise in, and together we can build a better model, a better strategy for them going forward. And that allows them to leverage what they're good at with what we're good at. And then you start sort of, it's the principle of exponential growth. Once everybody's doing the best thing that they can, the solution gets that much better because you have the best people doing the things they're best at.
Okay. And I mean, COVID was, or is, as we said already, unprecedented. There are other weird and wild disruptions happening in the world as well. I mean, we have Brexit coming down the line. For us here in Europe, it's a bigger issue, I suspect, than in the US. But there's the trade relations, as you mentioned, with China. There's the Hurricane Laura, I think, is the most recent one that hit off the east coast of the US. There's probably typhoons in the Pacific. Are those the kind of things that you manage as well for people? I presume wars and popping up in places, civil wars breaking out, Lukashenko in Belarus looking like there's going to be a bit of a shake-up there, all kinds of things of that happening.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Belarus. Most people don't care about Belarus, but we have quite a few folks in the agribusiness space. And Belarus is the number 2 or 3 producer, depending on the year, of fertilizer in the world.
Oh, yeah, it's a big potash exporter. That's right.
Huge. So, for most of the time, for most people look at Belarus and it's just a headline, but for some of our clients and some of our potential clients, Belarus is a huge deal. And it doesn't even have anything to do with Lukashenko, because Lukashenko is crazy. He does crazy stuff all the time. When the potash factory workers start going on strike, then you've got a whole new kind of world. And that happened about 2 weeks ago. So we've actually kind of been knee deep in it. That's actually one of the hardest parts of doing political risk, because you have to remove your personal political desires from it. I mean, I'm no fan of Lukashenko, obviously. I don't like what I see Russia doing in the context of this crisis. And
you don't like,
in Europe,
you don't like totalitarian states and dictators?
Oh, I don't give him the compliment of being totalitarian. He's just a petty authoritarian. You really have to go. I think only Kim Jong-un gets the totalitarian award. Maybe some of those ISIS guys. But you sort of have to put all that aside and drill in right on what we're talking about. But yes, so those examples are a lot of the risks that we deal with. A lot of these risks are not unprecedented. If you kind of go back at similar periods in history, I mean, we've got war and you've got insurgencies and you've got political instability. There are certain characteristics to the global system when you have rising and falling great powers, and suddenly supply chains go from being the purview of businesses to elements of national security. There's some precedents for that. The thing that you really have to lace in on top of it, and you alluded to it with Hurricane Laura, is that climate change, the climate's always been changing. There have always been climate contingencies in geopolitics, but we're at a whole different scale right now. And you could even say that COVID-19 is in part a result of climate change. If you go back and look at NIH and health studies, they predicted more diseases like this because the climate is changing and things are getting warmer. I've talked about this a couple different times in a few different articles and in a few different other podcasts. The real problem with COVID-19 was that it wasn't deadly enough. People mistook it for a flu. People mistook it for a pneumonia. You could just and everybody did it. China did it. The US did it. The EU did it. You just kind of shoved it under the rug because it wasn't that big of a deal until it was. Yeah. Ebola, if they'd found Ebola in China, like you're bleeding out of your eyeballs, like people are going to restrict you from getting out and it's going to stay there. Climate change is the same way. Imagine that thought experiment of the frog that is sitting in the water and it's just slowly turning up and up and up. So climate change is one of the big contingencies that we try and work through clients with, and it's one of the hardest to account for in a really specific way. But you have to these days because it's changing everything on top of all the geopolitical change that's happening. So.
Yeah, I remember reading a reinsurance report. I think it was Munich Re issuing a report talking about the number of weather-related catastrophes that have happened and how it's increased, I forget how many, 100% in the last decade. That's only going to get worse. So again, that's going to impact you and your clients and potential clients, I have to suspect, because, people are going to need to know what are the risks and what do we do about it?
Yeah, and sometimes it's too abstract. Like climate change is such an abstract thing that folks have difficulty getting their heads around it. But it's not recent. If you look back, for instance, in Syria, so we have a lot of energy clients too. If you look back in Syria, before the civil war kicked off, before ISIS broke out, before all this other stuff, the 3 years leading up to it, you had one of the worst droughts in Syria in recorded history.
Yep.
And you had a bunch of young Sunni Arab men who were flooding the cities because they couldn't grow crops anymore. And they were the ones that rebelled against the Assad regime. And they were the ones that set off this chain reaction that led to ISIS and led to the US-Iran nuclear deal and that falling apart. And everything you're seeing in the Middle East, everything connected to oil markets, all goes back to there was a drought in 2009, 2010 in Syria that was apocalyptic. So that's like one of the very tangible examples that I try to have folks zero in on. And then to bring that, today, you've probably seen this and folks have probably read reports of there are locusts running around Africa.
Correct. East Africa is a huge problem. Yeah.
It's a huge problem. And folks read that and they think, oh, maybe I should donate some money to the Red Cross, or, oh, that's really sad. Or they make a joke about how we're living in biblical end times. But that it's going to impact the food security for hundreds of millions of people in really, really important countries across really, really important supply chains. What's happening right now, and most folks probably don't care about northern Mozambique unless they're involved, in the natural gas explorations there in the north. But that's sort of a test case for everything that's happening there. You can bet that all the food security that is being threatened right now, we may not have a result for a year. It may take 2 years, but the political, cultural, supply chain, security considerations that are going to come out of this prolonged period of food insecurity, they're going to hit you. So if you're in any way exposed to the Indian Ocean, those supply chains, if you're thinking about Ethiopia, East Africa, all these other things, you should be really concerned about that sort of thing. So again, just another example of how, and I should also say the reason they're locusts was because of a warmer and wetter than usual monsoon season in 2018, 2019. So these things all build on top of each other, and you have to be constantly tracking them and be aware of how you have to shift based on what's going on, even if the immediate thing doesn't seem to apply to you or seems too big to understand.
Yeah, I joke that, I'm Irish and I've moved to live in the south of Spain, and I tell people I'm a climate refugee. But of course, and if you've ever been to Ireland, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But it's not a joke, really. Not my situation, but the term climate refugee is a term that didn't exist 10, 15 years ago. And now it's very much a thing.
It's a huge thing. And it's manifesting in two ways. There's the actual movement of peoples and disruption of politics and business and security. There is also now the politicization of climate. Because 10 years ago, people were arguing about, is there climate change? Is there not? Some morons still argue about that. But one of the things we're seeing in sort of the geopolitical space is that climate is now becoming a political football between nations. You've got the Mercosur EU trade deal, probably not going to happen because France and Germany are projecting themselves as leading environmental powers. It's really important for them to do that. And they can't work with the Bolsonaro government in Brazil and have any kind of trade agreement with them if he's going to continue burning the Amazon at these record rates.
Yeah.
In general, what's going on with South America, there's a lot of talk about nearshoring, especially for U.S. companies, about nearshoring supply chains to Latin and South America. And there's a lot that makes sense there. But one of the things I worry about is that Latin and South America, they're just repeating the cycle that they've been trapped in for hundreds of years. First it was gold, and then it was silver, and then it was tin. They mine it and they sell it, and they get a sort of a boom and then bust sort of thing. And now they're doing it with ag. They've become major ag exporters, and they're burning forest, and they're planting more and more and more. And there's going to be a boom, and then there's probably going to be a crash unless you can help them build domestic industry. But yeah, it's about climate refugees, but it's also about the politicization of climate. It's about who has access to the best tech to control climate change, because we're not going to be sharing technology anymore. This vaccine nationalism stuff we're seeing, it's going to extend well beyond that. It's going to extend to everything to new drought-resistant rice, genetics or vaccines for animals. We saw that with African swine fever and how that's impacted global markets. So it's the politicization of climate plus the actual effects that is giving you that double effect.
Okay. If you were a supply chain manager today, what advice would you give supply chain managers today? What should they do to mitigate risk, manage risk for now and for the next, 10, well, that's too long. Let's say 5 years. What's best practice?
The most important thing is you need to know what's going on. You need as much data, as much knowledge as possible about what's going on. And that means you can't just know your primary suppliers. You need to know your secondary and your tertiary, and you have to build all that stuff up. And then in addition to that, you need to think about, how could this go wrong? What could change, and what options have I developed to handle it? I think of supply chain, the metaphor I've been using lately is, supply chain managers are the superheroes of their companies. And you need the knowledge of what's going on in your supply chain the same way that Batman needs all of his gadgets and his car and this, that, the other thing. And then you need Alfred. You need the strategist who is there looking over your shoulder, telling you when you're being an idiot, telling you when you need to be looking at this thing that you've lost complete sight of because you're a human and you're doing other things. And then you, the supply chain manager, you have to think that way. You have to be the vigilante who is running around telling folks, no, we need this. We need to have this in place. We can no longer just be thinking about a lean, efficient supply chain. It needs to be flexible and resilient. And we have to pay a premium for reliability. And we have to think about how politics is going to affect reliability rather than just simply getting that bottom line number down as quickly as possible. So for me, the best practice is, number one, map out the supply chain and get as detailed as you can about every single segment of it. And then B, take a step back, and whether it's me or someone in your company or somebody else that you want to talk to, pick it apart. Imagine what it looks like if you're wrong. Imagine what it looks like if you're only half right. Really engage with that and have backup plans, because you're going to need them in the next 5 years. It's the most geopolitically unstable environment I've seen in the short term. That period right after Fukushima and the Arab Spring and the Libyan intervention, it's kind of like that, except I don't see an end point here. That sort of period in the global system ended within 6 to 12 months. I think we're in a prolonged period of instability, and you're just going to have to be on your toes. You're going to have those systems and processes in place if you're going to respond in real time and not get taken off guard by some of these things which are predictable and which you can prepare for as long as you're doing the hard work now.
Yeah, it's fascinating because for so long, I think people in supply chain have been told that, supply chain is a cost center and it needs to be trimmed and it needs to be made as lean as possible. And of course, we had then this happen at the start of the year, and the leaning of the supply chains, if we're going to call it that, the trimming of them made them brittle. And, people were sure they were reducing costs, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I gotta think that introduced a major amount of risk.
I think you're right, but I would change what you said just a little bit, in the sense that it's not that the supply chains got increasingly leaner and then they became so lean that they were brittle. What happened was the international political context in which everybody was operating changed. You had a major paradigm change. So in a world where globalization is the dominant political force, where the WTO is doing what it's doing, and where nations fundamentally trust each other or fundamentally believe in a rules-based order where everybody basically is following, everybody cheats a little bit, where everybody is basically following the same rules, yeah, you can have a lean supply chain. There's no reason to have backup options in that globalized, idealistic world. And we were in that world from about 91 until, you can call it 2013, 2016. We can argue about whatever date it is. Made good sense then. What's changed is the world has changed around us. So it's not that the supply chains have become leaner to the point of brittle. It's that they are not strong enough for the forces that are buffeting them right now, because globalization's out. It's not happening. It's a more geopolitical world. You've got a multipolar world, and that's just a wonky IR term to say that there are different nodes of competing political, economic, and military power around the world trying to carve out spheres of influence for themselves, or trying to hold on for dear life and not lose the political power and influence that they have. And in that environment, you can't work the way you did before. You're going to have backup options. You're going to have to diversify. It's not, the world is not just greased for your supply chain to move. You're going to actually have to do some hard work into figuring that out. So it's not so much that we went from lean to brittle. It's that because of the global context, we need to go back to the gym. We need to be a little bit stronger. We need to put on 20 pounds of muscle so that we can deal with the forces, rather than trusting that our yoga and our thinning out of our muscles is actually what's going to do best for us in this environment.
Interesting. Okay. Jacob, we're coming up on the 20-minute mark, or in fact, we've gone over the 20-minute mark at this point, which is, when I start to wrap up. So at this point, I like to ask people, is there anything that we've not talked about that you think it's important for people to be aware of?
I think we've covered most of it. The two things I would just say, and I know that I've listened to your podcast before, and I know you guys think a lot about Industry 4.0, and would just direct folks to the Perch Perspective website, or maybe we can put a link in the podcast.
Absolutely.
We did a piece. We did a piece called Geopolitics 4.0, and I really do think every single stage of the Industrial Revolution, 1.0 is steam power, 2.0 electricity. As you go up, there has been a corresponding geopolitical counter-reaction before the real benefits of that Industrial Revolution have happened. And I think that's where we are right now. The examples, you have the discovery of steam power. It's not a coincidence that you get the French and American revolutions, the Franco-German War, German unification, the collapse of the Qing Empire. All that stuff is inextricably linked. Just like World War I and World War II are linked to the Second Industrial Revolution, the Cold War, and the Digital Revolution are joined at the hip. We're now just at the cusp of that Fourth Industrial Revolution, and we're in the midst of the geopolitical counter-reaction. This US-China competition, we're at the very beginning. Things are going to get worse before they get better. I'm bullish long-term about the trajectory of these things and these tools, but in the short term, there's going to be a lot of instability, and it's happened at every single phase along the way. So that's sort of the way I frame and structure. We've talked a lot about a lot of things in this podcast here, but if you want one word to think about this, or if you're trying to sell this to somebody who's telling you, no, you just need to cut costs, tell them, look, if you believe in Industry 4.0, Geopolitics 4.0 is here, and we're going to have to deal with it. And just cutting costs is not a way to deal with it. So we've tried to inject that term into the space to give people a real firm concept upon which they can make better decisions, and also argue up the chain of command that, no, this is a place you're going to have to spend money. You do not want to economize your supply chain right now. Economize somewhere else, but your supply chain right now in this political environment, it needs everything you've got if you're going to get through this and survive.
Yeah, it's going to be, if nothing else, it's going to be a competitive differentiator investing in it.
Absolutely.
Jacob, that's been fantastic. Where can people learn more about Jacob, about geopolitics, about Perch Perspectives, about Geopolitics 4.0? You mentioned a report on your website, so send me the link afterwards, and I'll link to it in the description as well. So, but tell me where to direct people.
Sure. And, I'm the founder, chief strategist, but we've got a great team at Perch Perspectives. That was one of the things that's really important to me. A lot of the folks that are doing political risk assessments and consulting, it's developed around a guru or sort of a one-person genius shop, and I don't want that. There are times where we'll have internal analytical disagreements, and we'll present both to a client, because I really do think a team is better than just any one individual, any one methodology. So we try and do those sorts of things. But to find out more about us and the team, perchperspectives.com is the website. We have a twice a week free newsletter for folks who are just interested in our highest, sort of broadest level insights. We also do a podcast once every 2 weeks. You can find that on the website. And then we're on social media, all the usual things. And I'll be sure to link you to that report that I mentioned. But and also, if you want to talk to me more, I'm sure you can give folks my contact information, but info@perchperspectives.com. I read that every day. So if you just want to chat, you want to tell me something, or if you want to talk more about what Perch can do for you, that's an easy way to get to us.
Perfect. Jacob, that's been fantastic. Thanks a million for coming on the show today.
Thanks, Tom. I can't wait to join you in Spain sometime with all this craziness is over.
We'll have a couple of tapas and some beers.
Sounds good. An Irishman and a guy I'm not Scottish, but my family's Scottish. So an Irishman and a Scotsman drinking in Seville sounds pretty good.
Sounds great. Thanks a million, Jacob. Okay, we've come to the end of the show. Thanks everyone for listening. If you'd like to know more about digital supply chains, head on over to sap.com/digital supply chain, or simply drop me an email to tom.raftery@sap.com. If you like the show, please don't forget to subscribe to it in your podcast application of choice to get new episodes as soon as they're published. Also, please don't forget to rate and review the podcast. It really does help new people to find the show. Thanks. Catch you all next time.